During an interview with American journalist Tucker Carlson, Russian President Vladimir Putin presented a monologue on Ukrainian and Russian history as relates to the current conflict between the two countries. So, I decided to look into Putin's historical narrative, check it for accuracy, and provide additional context where required. This will also help shed light on his geopolitical views and goals. We begin by addressing the first historical claims presented in the English translation of his statements. The Russian state became centralized in 862 when the city of Novgorod invited Prince Rurik from Scandinavia from the Vikings in 862. In 882, the successor of Rurik, Prince Oleg, came to Kiev. So there were two centers of the state, in Kiev and in Novgorod back then. The next red-letter date was 888, the conversion into Christianity, when Prince Vladimir accepted Eastern Christianity, the Orthodox faith, in Kiev. Since then, the centralized power in Russia got entrenched with a single territory, a single economy, one and the same language, and after the baptism of Rus, they had the same faith and the rule of a grand prince, and the centralized Russian state was fledgling. Here Putin is describing the early days of Kievan Rus, a state and later confederation of principalities, which was ruled by the Rurikid dynasty, established by the previously mentioned Viking Rurik. His successor, Oleg, expanded the realm to the south, capturing Kiev and making it the capital of the Rus lands. The Kievan Rus continued to expand over a period of time, uniting the East Slavic tribes into a confederation, with the Grand Prince of Kiev holding authority over the rulers of the lesser principalities. Grand Prince Vladimir I, also known as the Great, was responsible for the Christianization of Kievan Rus. While these historical facts are broadly correct, the idea that this was the origin of the centralized Russian state, or of the Russian nation in a modern sense, is incorrect. By claiming that Kievan Rus was the first Russian state, Putin suggests that all East Slavic groups descending from the Rus are essentially Russian, for example, the Ukrainians and Belarusians. The implication here would be that these groups cannot have a cultural, linguistic, or national identity distinct from that of Russia. In reality, the Kievan Rus were the cultural ancestors of several East Slavic peoples, including Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. While it would be fair to say that all three groups are related as descendants of the Rus, it is inaccurate to claim that they are one and the same people. The cultural groups diverged from their common origin and have grown distinct from each other as a result of various historical processes, as we shall see. Different reasons led to the feudal partitioning of ancient Rus. That partitioned state, Russian state, fell prey to the empire established by Chinggis Khan, and Khan Batu came to Rus. Cities like Kiev and others lost their independence, while northern cities of Russia preserved part of their sovereignty. They paid tribute to the yoke, and later the centralized Russian state became fledgling in the northwestern part of Russia. Here Putin goes on to describe the decline and disintegration of Kievan Rus, which took place between the 11th and 13th centuries. Dynastic conflict and civil war led to fragmentation and greater independence of the various principalities. Mongol invasions of the mid-13th century marked the end of Kievan Rus as a unified state. The Rus principalities were made vassals of the Golden Horde, a successor state to Genghis Khan's Mongol Empire, known as the period of the Tatar yoke. Over the 13th and 14th centuries, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania wrested control of western and southern Rus lands from the Golden Horde. This essentially created a split in the Rus people, with the western Rus being under the control of Lithuania and the eastern Rus being tributaries of the Tatars. This period also saw the emergence of the first real Russian state, which arose from the Principality of Muscovy. Initially a vassal of the Mongol Khans, Muscovy gradually absorbed other eastern Rus principalities until it grew powerful enough to defeat the Tatars in 1480. It was this Principality of Muscovy which developed into the Tsardom of Russia in 1547, and eventually the Russian Empire in 1721. The southern lands of Russia were gravitating towards another center, the one of Europe, the Grand Lithuanian Duchy. The Lithuanian-Russian Duchy, as the ethnic Russians constituted a major part, and they were Orthodox in faith, and they spoke the ancient Russian language there. But later the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania were unified, so those lands were transferred to the Polish and Lithuanian state, but for decades the Poles tried to convert those Russians, trying to insert and entrench an idea that those were not specifically and fully Russian. As discussed earlier, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania gained significant amounts of territory in the Rus lands, roughly corresponding to parts of Belarus and the western part of modern Ukraine. It is misleading to label the conquered Western Rus people as Russians, since the Russian nation itself was still in the process of formation through the Principality of Muscovy. Instead, East Slavic people in the Lithuanian Grand Duchy were given the name Ruthenians. They spoke the Old East Slavic language, referred to as the Ancient Russian language by Putin, and were followers of the Orthodox Christian faith. This was in contrast to the Catholic ruling elite of the unified kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania. It was during this period that the Russian and Ruthenian cultures began to form and diverged from their shared roots. The Ruthenian people are considered to be the ancestors of today's Ukrainian and Belarusian ethnic groups. The Poles tried to assimilate the Russian population there and treated those lands in a tough or even cruel way. All that led to that part of the Russian land struggle for their rights. In 1654, they turned to Moscow so that Moscow could establish its power over them. The war with Poland began, and it lasted for 13 years, and afterwards a truce was enacted. 32 years afterwards, the eternal peace with Poland was established and proclaimed, and all the left bank of the Dnieper River, including Kiev, became part of Russia, and the right bank of Dnieper became part of Poland. In the mid-17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth faced rebellion from the Cossacks, who were another group of East Slavic people, and Ruthenian peasants in the eastern territories of the state. They broke free from Poland-Lithuania, creating the Cossack Hetmanate, which is considered to be the first proto-Ukrainian state. The Hetmanate allied with Russia through the Pereyaslav Agreement of 1654, swearing allegiance to the Tsar and becoming a protectorate of Russia. This arrangement led to the 13-year Russo-Polish War of 1654 to 1667, in which Russia gained control of the land on the left bank of the Dnieper, including Kiev. This corresponds to the territory on the east bank of the river in modern-day Ukraine. Poland-Lithuania was left holding the territory on the right bank, that is, west of the river Dnieper. These territorial changes were ratified by the Treaty of Eternal Peace in 1686, and the lands of the Cossack Hetmanate were split. Right bank Ukraine remained in the control of Poland-Lithuania, while the Cossacks of left bank Ukraine enjoyed a degree of self-rule within the Russian Tsardom. Even within Russia, the Cossack Hetmanate's autonomy was gradually eroded, until it was eventually abolished and incorporated into the Russian Empire in 1764. Before World War I, using the ideas of Ukraine ethnicity and origin, the Austrian General Staff started promoting the Ukrainian identity. In view of the First World War, they wanted to weaken the prospective enemy. The idea that those people residing in that territory were not specifically and wholly Russian was later promoted by the Austrian General Staff. By the end of the 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been carved up by its neighbors, Austria-Hungary, Prussia, and the Russian Empire. The westernmost portion of modern Ukraine was absorbed by Austria-Hungary. As national movements swept through 19th century Europe, Ukrainians too began to forge a national identity and to develop a formalized, literary version of the Ukrainian language. Aiming to suppress the growth of Ukrainian national consciousness, the Russian Empire issued decrees banning the use of Ukrainian in print and forbidding speeches, lectures, and plays in Ukrainian throughout its territory. Ukrainian novelists and poets faced political repression. Putin claims that this Ukrainian national revival was a plot by the Austrians to create a separatist identity and weaken the Russian Empire, the implication here being that Ukrainian nationalism is an illegitimate foreign creation. Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, gave Ukraine its own territory, and for decades the Ukrainian Soviet Republic was part of the USSR. And to unknown reasons, the Bolsheviks promoted the Ukrainian culture and language. This is how Soviet Ukraine was created. After the Second World War, Ukraine received part of the lands that had belonged to Poland and part of the land that had belonged to Hungary and Romania before, so in this sense, Ukraine is an artificial state. By the early 20th century, the idea of Ukraine as a distinct nation, separate from Russia, Poland, and Austria-Hungary, had grown in prominence. the collapse of the Russian Empire and the ensuing Russian Civil War led to the creation of several short-lived Ukrainian states. Eventually, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was created in 1919 and became a founding member of the Soviet Union in 1922. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union supported a policy of indigenization. Non-Russian ethnicities were to be integrated into the governments of their native Soviet republics, promoting buy-in to the greater Soviet project. As a result of this, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic also underwent a period of Ukrainization. The Ukrainian language and culture were heavily promoted within the republic, and Ukrainian became the standard language of education, workplace, and government affairs. By the 1930s, however, this policy was reversed, and instead bourgeois nationalism was deemed counter-revolutionary. The development of a strong Ukrainian national identity was considered to be a threat to Ukraine's loyalty to the Soviet Union, and purges of Ukrainian scholars, intellectuals, and other cultural leaders were carried out. This also coincided with the Holodomor, a famine caused by policies of agricultural collectivization, in which between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians were killed. Extreme death and destruction were visited upon the Ukrainian Republic during this period and in the Second World War. After this, the territory was expanded by the addition of land annexed from pre-war Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. So, did Putin present an accurate picture of Russian and Ukrainian history, or did he lie? Well, while the historical facts and events presented are broadly accurate, they are presented in a selective manner to craft a misleading narrative. The major claims of this narrative are: the first, that Kievan Rus was the first Russian state and served as the origin point of the Russian nation. This means that all Rus-descended peoples are one and the same, and are members of the broader Russian cultural group. As discussed earlier, this is misleading. Kievan Rus could just as well be claimed as the first Ukrainian state or the first Belarusian state, since both these groups have the same historical ties to the Rus as the Russians do. More importantly, ethnic identities and the notion of a nation-state for a specific people did not exist in the early medieval period in the same way that they do today. The Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian identities had not been formed at the time, and the first real Russian state only came into existence around the late 15th century. Second, that the development of the Ukrainian identity is in some way illegitimate, since in Putin's view, it was either created or heavily influenced by external powers, such as Poland, Lithuania, and Austria-Hungary. This claim is not very convincing. The development of a Ukrainian national identity was the result of various historical processes, including outside influences. But this is the case for any national identity or political ideology. None of them arise in a vacuum, completely free of historical conditions and the influences of neighboring countries. Furthermore, the 19th century Ukrainian national revival did not only take place in Austrian-occupied West Ukraine. Political organizations within the Ukrainian territories of the Russian Empire were also involved in this movement, but they were harshly suppressed by Russian authorities. Ukrainian authors, poets, and artists were punished for their activities, and the Ukrainian language was banned from being used in print or being taught in schools. Finally, that Ukraine is an artificial state which was first granted its original territory and then expanded in size by the actions of the Soviet Union. This claim also does not hold water, since by these standards all states would be so-called artificial creations, as they are created through settlement, colonization, warfare, and treaties between states. These processes are just as legitimate when applied to Ukraine as they are to any other state. If the lands gained by the Russian Empire through diplomacy and conquest in the past are legitimate parts of modern Russia, then the lands gained by the Ukrainian Soviet Republic in the past are also legitimate parts of modern Ukraine. Finally, in 1991, when 92% of the Ukrainian population voted for independence and the USSR itself was dissolved, the independence of this state was recognized by the international community at large, including the Russian Federation. It seems clear, then, that Putin's attempts to deny the Ukrainian national identity and right to a nation are misleading and ill-founded, aimed at justifying Russia's aggression against Ukraine in the past, as well as the ongoing invasion and war in the present day.